Billy Blue, my knight in shining brindle. Welcome to another episode of A Poet Reads to Write. Today I would like to take you back to the world of ancient Iraq. Oh boy, the Greeks called it, didn't they? Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. And the rivers, of course, are the great Euphrates and Tigris. The Mesopotamian world, ancient Iraq, those civilizations that I guess started with Sumer and the great shaft graves of the Chaldeans, of Ur. And after the Sumerians, there were the Babylonians, and then the Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians, and the Neo-Assyrian Empire, before everything was destroyed by the rise of ancient Iran to the north, and of course, the great Persian Empire, the Medes and the Persians. This is a part of the world, ancient Iran and ancient Iraq, I've just always been very, very drawn to. Largely because I've been trying to understand the Hebrew Bible, its context, the civilizations in which it was, wrote, redacted or edited and all brought together. You can't understand the Hebrew Bible without understanding what was going on in the ancient Near East with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians. And another thing that's brought me to this world, I suppose, this quirky, whimsical world of the ancient Iran and ancient Iraq. There's several tags at the moment doing the rounds of BookTube. And one of the prompts in many of these tags is to get you to name your one literary person, your one literary hero that you would love to spend an evening with. And for me, oh boy, if I could spend an evening with one literary hero, it would be the great Irving Finkel, great Dr. Finkel, the keeper of cuneiform clay tablets and texts in the British Museum, the keeper of cuneiform. Oh boy, Irving Finkel. Of course, cuneiform was not a language, it was a system of writing. And cuneiform was such a wonderful system, so rich with its, ways of creating written language, that it was used by first the Sumerians and the Chaldeans, of Ur, but particularly the Sumerians used it. And then, of course, as the great language of the Akkadians rose, and it was Akkadian particularly that was spoken particularly by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And so Akkadian also adopted cuneiform as its written script. And then, of course, it was adopted also by the Persians and by the Hittites even further to the north. They all used, the great Elamite empires, the Medes, they all used cuneiform as their written language to capture their languages. So cuneiform is this incredibly rich system of language used right through, ancient Iraq, Iran, going right up to Turkey. And Irving Finkel is the keeper of cuneiform. These, cuneiform written on these clay tablets have been discovered right through Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. What a job, the keeper of cuneiform at the British Museum. Irving Finkel is just this huge literary hero for me. He's never been an archaeologist himself. He's a linguist. His specialty has always been in the written language, in deciphering cuneiform. He did a PhD, didn't he, many, many years ago on Babylonian exorcism. been always focused on ghosts and ancient Near Eastern magic, the occult. It's what's always drawn him. And of course, Finkel himself is, of course, a Jewish British person who's lived all his adult life in London. So he's always been very, very interested in the occult, in deciphering ancient Near Eastern magical systems, in particular focused around demons and ghosts. And this wonderful book that he's written is his newest book, his big tome on ghosts. And this is what's going to be the actual focus of this video. Irving Finkel, my great literary hero. For me, the study of ancient Iraq, looking particularly at the Sumerians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians, it all began for me with books like this. George's Roux, Ancient Iraq, one of the great classic of, I suppose, 20, 30 years ago. But it's still, most of it is still very relevant and up to date. It's a wonderful read if you want to know anything about ancient Iraq, particularly the Sumerians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. Then, of course, there's the great Saggs, his everyday life in Babylonia and Assyria. That's a wonderful read. This is just a really popular, written for a very general audience. It's a hoot, full of, wonderful photographs and colour plates. And then, of course, there's the great Hallo and Simpson, this book on the ancient Near East. But again, particularly focused on the Sumerians, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians. That is a fabulous book. And for me, the first book I ever got that really started this love affair with ancient Iraq was this one by Carla on the Assyrian Empire, and particularly focusing on the relationships between the Hebrew Bible and the ancient, the Iron Age Jewish people and their relationships with the Assyrians. Carla Archer was an Anglican priest in the Bathurst Diocese, just west of the Blue Mountains, west of Sydney in New South Wales in Australia. And this was my first introduction to all of this. And oh boy, I love Carla Archer to bits. This is quite an interesting academic text. It's probably focused more, I guess, on senior school students, maybe studying ancient history for the higher school certificate and for undergraduates at university. So this is like sort of a text, an introduction to ancient Assyria, really focused at, school leavers and early undergraduate type ancient history students looking at ancient Assyria, ancient Iraq. It's a wonderful book, and I just love Carla Archer. She started it all for me. And then recently I've been able to buy these books on Babylonia. Babylonia gets a bad press in the Hebrew Bible, doesn't it? It was the great city of Marduk, the great city that was built by the god Marduk. So it gets a really bad press in the Hebrew Bible. But Babylon, wow. In the ancient Near East, it really was the ancient equivalent of, I guess, what we would look at as Rome, Mecca. Babylon was the center of everything, wasn't it? The center of learning, of libraries, of so much cuneiform study, systems of magic, manuals for necromancy, and all sorts of things. So here's a book by Michael Seymour and another one by Paul-Alain Beaulieu on ancient Babylonia. I've just always absolutely loved it. And of course, a lot of this stuff began by the British East India Company in the 18th and 19th centuries during the heyday of British imperialism. And, it was the East India Company that sent all these people all over the world for trade, for commerce. And one of the people who was employed by the East India Company as a soldier, because, the East India Company, this British company, it was as powerful and as wealthy as most European nations. It was a huge company at the heyday of British imperialism. And one of the people who worked for them, of course, was this guy, Henry Rawlinson. He was actually a soldier and an adventurer, a great sportsman of his day. This is 200 years ago. And it was Rawlinson, of course, who won the race. as they were going through what we now call Iran, Iraq, and they started to do archaeological digs, and they were discovering, great cities. There were always, great tells, mounds that people always knew were full of archaeological wonders. And when they started to dig these places, they started discovering thousands and thousands of clay tablets with what was obviously writing, this wedge-shaped writing into the clay tablets. And of course, at that stage, when they first started discovering all these tablets, no one knew how to decipher them, to read them. And it was Henry Rawlinson, this soldier from the East India Company, who discovered this great cliff face where there were, by the Persian king actually, so it was the Persian adoption of cuneiform script. And they had this trilingual, so in 3 different languages, these columns declaring, of course, the great might, the power of the Persian king. And it was Rawlinson who scaled this cliff face to write down very accurately everything that was written on this cliff face in the 3 different languages, all written in cuneiform. And he used this trilingual script, a bit like the Rosetta Stone was used to decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. It was Rawlinson who used this trilingual script high up on this mountain face to decipher cuneiform as a system of writing. And he began it all, I guess. And of course, then once we learned to read these scripts, oh boy, the things that were discovered. And one of the first things we discovered, of course, is that these great cuneiform tablets were being discovered in such concentrations in certain areas that archaeologists began to realize that they were the first great ancient libraries. You couldn't explain this great concentration of cuneiform on clay tablets in any other way. And much of the writing, of course, was just every mundane, administrative, to do with taxation or sales or the recording of goods. But very quickly, they began to discover that many of these clay tablets, as they began to put the pieces all back together again and reassemble these tablets, they began to discover that many of these clay tablets told the most incredible, rich stories of ancient Near Eastern myths and legends. And of course, the most famous of them, the greatest of them by a mile, is of course the Epic of Gilgamesh. For me, the translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh that I've always lived with and absolutely loved is this one by Stephen Mitchell. Stephen Mitchell is not a cuneiform scholar himself. He's a great historian and writer of texts. So he's more a creative writer. So he adopted something, a real a literal translation of cuneiform, of the tablets bearing the Gilgamesh, and he has used the translation of that to rewrite his own very dramatic, very richly dramatic and very evocative verse translation into modern English of it's a free verse translation into modern English of the Epic of Gilgamesh. So that's the book I've always lived with, the translation I've always lived with, and I always loved it to bits. It's fabulous. It's a real hoot to read. But a couple of years ago, I think he's Danish. This young scholar, this guy is an actual cuneiform scholar, Sophus Helle, and he actually has done his own now verse translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, and he's translated it himself, going back to the cuneiform and working with the cuneiform text on the clay tablets in the British Museum. And he's come up with this beautiful book. This is a real scholarly introduction to the Epic of Gilgamesh. It has his verse translation of the epic, plus a lot of scholarly essay material and lots of notes and amendments and appendices, and it's a fabulous book. So this is now the version of the Epic of Gilgamesh that I really enjoy spending my time with. This is just fantastic. So finally, we have arrived perhaps at Irving Finkel, my great literary hero. His first great popular work of history was, of course, the Ark before Noah. Because the Epic of Gilgamesh also contains a rich story of an ark of a great flood, and how one person or one family was chosen to save humanity and animals. And it's an incredibly rich, interesting story where the whole Genesis story came from, because these stories in the ancient Iran and ancient Iraq, they were written down 1,000 years before the Iron Age. So 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible was first beginning to be written and edited, redacted, brought together. This is 1,000 years before all of that. Ancient Iran and ancient Iraq, it goes right back, doesn't it? Not only in the Iron Age, but right back to the Bronze Age and to the Neolithic. We think, Egyptologists would tell you that the city and language and everything started in Egypt. But I think now the arguments are probably quite settled that writing and the city, religion, all of these things that we now so closely identify with civilization. These things began in the ancient Near East, in the Mesopotamian world, in ancient Iraq and ancient Iran. And so this is a really important book. So he first of all did this book, as I said, The Ark Before Noah, looking at the very earliest in the Cuneiform, in Sumerian and Akkadian, the languages used by the Babylonians and the Assyrians. He was first of all looking at that and the Noah's Ark type thing. And he's done some fantastic stuff on YouTube, actually rebuilding a type of Noah's Ark. Looking at the dimensions and everything that was in these texts and trying to recreate what the actual original prototype for the ark might have looked like. It's a fantastic series of videos. Irving Finkel, he's just a hero of mine. But just very recently, he's brought out this book on the first ghosts. He knows, of course, that there are, older civilizations that have ghost stories. In my country, Australia, first Australian people have been on this continent for more than 60,000 years. And they have very rich stories about ghosts and exorcisms and how ghosts can enter the body through the ear or the mouth while you are asleep in particular and run amok, cause havoc. And there were lots of incantations and things for treating with ghosts, if you like. There are lots of sacred places to do with the Nabaya or the spirit folk, all sorts of things. So Irving Finkel does know that there are older civilizations that had ghost stories. The ghost stories didn't start in the ancient Near East. He knows that. But his argument is that it was the people from the ancient Near East, in using the cuneiform text, that were the first to write down their ghost stories. So these are the first ghost stories, if you like, that are attested to in the written form. We can actually go back and read what these ancients thought about ghosts, how they lived with ghosts. Because as Irving Finkel says, ghosts were an everyday occurrence in the ancient Near East. Everybody believed in ghosts. Almost everybody would have seen them, communicated with them, had dealings with them. And most of our the dealings with ghosts at this time were, of course, mundane, ordinary, quite all right. You only needed to bring in a diviner or an exorcist or something to try and get rid of the ghost, to put it back down into the netherworld if it was running amok and causing problems, if it was malevolent in some way. So most dealings with ghosts were actually very familial and familiar. Everything was fine. So this is the rich story that Irving Finkel tells in this book. This is a book, he's gone back to the cuneiform text in the British Museum. Every text, every reference that he could find to ghosts. He's translated all of the stories and he's brought everything together into this incredibly rich book called The First Ghosts. And it's an absolute hoot to read. It's just wonderful. So as I said, Irving Finkel, as a young bloke, he did his doctoral thesis on Babylonian exorcistic magic, looking again at the cuneiform text. So he never worked as an archaeologist himself. He spent all his time in the British Museum studying these cuneiform texts and trying to put together all the pieces, recreate these tablets, and then be able to read and translate what is written on them. And Finkel, he's really interesting. In this book, he has a very sympathetic treatment about ghosts. He doesn't look at ghosts as a secular, modern, cynical person. He really does put himself back into the mindset of the ancient Assyrians and Sumerians and Babylonians who really believed in ghosts and lived with them. And, that's the very generous way that Finkel approaches the subject in here. So this is not a book of cynical, secular atheism. This is a book where it is simply a given that ghosts exist, and this is what you do if you have a run-in with one. If it's a good run-in, you can do this. If it was a negative run-in, if you've been unlucky enough to meet a malevolent ghost, this is what you can do. This is just a fabulous book. It's such a quirky, whimsical, very generous work of history, recreating the world of ghosts in ancient Sumer, Assyria, and Babylonia. So ancient Iraq. It's just fabulous. And he traces the belief in ghosts all the way back to the Neolithic, to Homo sapiens and Neanderthal. And, the whole idea of being buried and grave goods. And what does that say about possible beliefs in the afterlife? Because, if you're burying people, whether they're Neanderthal or Homo sapiens, if you're burying people with goods, presumably, you're burying them with goods because they need them in the afterlife. In other words, it's this classic beginnings of dualism. That there is this soul, this spirit inside the person. And when you die, the body might die and go into the ground, but the spirit, the soul, something else goes out and has to be captured and sent somewhere and managed. Ghosts. It's just really interesting. So he goes right back to the Neolithic times and to beginnings of, burials with grave goods. And what does that maybe say about religious beliefs and practices? And what are the origins of ghost stories and our living with ghosts? So some who crossed over or went down and returned. And in this book, in the world of the ancient Near East, ghosts are usually insubstantial and flimsy. But when returned, that is always of consequence. Sometimes the consequence, as I said, is quite benign and good. But there were, of course, malevolent ghosts as well that you needed to treat very carefully. They could really run amok and do damage. Not only make you sick, but make whole towns, whole cities sick. So there were all these formulas and rituals, and Irving Finkel, he spends a lot of time translating cuneiform texts to do with rituals and incantations, spells for the management, the treatment of ghosts. It's a fabulous book. It's so evocative and very, very rich. The other interesting thing about the Mesopotamian world, of course, in ancient Iraq, is that many people, when they died, they were actually buried beneath the floor of the living quarters of the people's house. So you lived very closely with your ancestors, your grandparents, your great-grandparents. They were literally buried beneath the floor of the house. So when people saw ghosts, usually these ghosts, as I said, were benign. They were fine. Most ghosts who were encountered were, of course, familial, family members, and they were very familiar. It was in the context that the body was buried beneath the living quarters of the house, and you were having encounters with ancient people. And as long as you were paying the ghost proper respect, fulfilling all the things to look after the ghost, to make their life a little sweeter in the netherworld, most encounters with ghosts were very benign. Only things usually went amok when a ghost had a grievance, when it wasn't being looked after properly, treated with the necessary respect by the living. That's when often there were problems. So most ghosts were tolerated and treated with sympathy. They were every day. As I said, it was only when there was about vengeance or malice that there was a problem, because ghosts had rights. When you read Hammurabi's law code, the great law codes of the ancient Near East, of the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, just like the living had rights, ghosts had rights. It's such an interesting way of looking at the world, so different from ours. It's just amazing. So ghosts expected the living to sweeten their lot, because the life of, consuming dust, of living in the netherworld, the underworld, was not always nice. It was not a nice world like living in our world. And so ghosts expected fair treatment by the living to sweeten their lot, to give them, clean, sweet water, to feed them with nourishment, and to give them grave goods. Anything that could make their life in the netherworld a little more bearable. And Irving Finkel recreates, he translates, and he gives us all these great spells. And they're just amazing. There are spells that needed to be recited 3 times and sealed with libations. And there are things that he has translated here from diviners and exorcists to assess what is the portents. And, all this, as I said, the fear of a ghost entering through the ear while you are asleep. And he gives us photographs and translates the cuneiform on amulets, both inscribed and uninscribed. And people, the way, these amulets were worn about the body or hung in particular places in the home. And you could purchase them from exorcists and diviners to help give you protection, to live more benignly, if you like, with ghosts. Because as I said, everyone believed in ghosts. It was a way of managing this and making the interaction with ghosts more benign. So Irving Finkel in his book spends a lot of time translating all these cuneiform texts to give us an insight into the rich understanding of ghosts in the ancient Near East. And then he says, if these malevolent ghosts persist, the exorcist would make a preparation of cedar oil, sulfur, algae, bitumen, and 1 or 2 plants. And this concoction would be smeared over particular parts of the house, in particular gates, doorways, bedposts, to try and keep the person safe. And there were particular incantations that would either be repeated, chanted 3 times or 7 times. And these libations would be poured. And they would pour libations of donkey urine from an ox hoof. It's just an amazing stuff. It's just such a different way of being in the world. And Irving Finkel in this book, he gives us this wonderful insight into what it would have been like to have been an ancient Assyrian or Babylonian living with ghosts and managing ghosts and having to deal with them. It's just a part of your normal, everyday workabout life. There's one story in particular. He has a whole chapter on the Epic of Gilgamesh in here too. Because Gilgamesh, of course, was the great, he was the great hero, the Alexander the Great, the great Achilles, if you like. He was that sort of figure in ancient Near East. The Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Assyrians, they all told stories about Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the great hero. And he, of course, after he lost his best friend, Enkidu, Gilgamesh goes on this great adventure to try and win immortality. So he has Irving Finkel in this book has a whole chapter, of course, on Gilgamesh and on the quest for immortality and what that says about our ideas about death and ghosts and all that sort of thing. And, Gilgamesh's relationship with the ghost of Enkidu, his best friend, his intimate. But in this story, he also has a chapter on this incredible story that was found in these cuneiform tablets in Nineveh. And when they were discovered, it was about the Assyrian prince in the netherworld. Because, of course, in ancient Assyrian religion, no living person was ever allowed, of course, to go to the land of the dead and to return. It was only for the dead. And there were many gods and spirits and demons who guarded all the gates, who kept the living out and away from the netherworld. This city beneath the ground. Because, in the Assyrian way of looking at the world, the Babylonian way of looking at the world, there was heaven above. And of course, there were 3 levels of heaven as well. The very top level of heaven was for the gods. The bottom level of heaven was, of course, for our sun and the moon and all the stars. The heavens that we had access to through our visual senses. Then there was our world, the earth in the middle, and then of course the netherworld or the underworld, the world of the dead, down below. And it also had 3 levels. This incredibly sophisticated way of dealing and explaining, encapsulating all of this spirituality. And Irving Finkel in this book, he gives you this wonderful insight into this way of being in the world, this way of thinking about spirits and ghosts and, the heavens, the underworld, the netherworld. It's an astounding book. So anyway, these tablets were discovered in Nineveh, deciphered by my great hero, Irving Finkel. And it's been called the Assyrian Prince in the Netherworld. It's actually a story about a prince of Assyria who apparently either is in a dream state or maybe in a literal physical journey state. He went down to the land of the dead and returned. It is the only story in the whole of the ancient Near East that we've discovered anyway, that's been preserved, that tells of this journey from somebody who is living into the underworld and who has come back to tell us what it was all about. And this prince, Kumeya, who lived a life of indulgence and exploitation and corruption. So he was a very bad boy. He was, a corrupt, abusive prince who was really running amok in Nineveh and living, really living it up. The very worst young man, getting up to a lot of no good. And he also hobnobbed with state diviners who specialize in reading animal entrails. So he had a real thing with this as well. And he liked to think that he could read the future and make that part of his party lifestyle. So eventually, the king of Assyria knows that this young prince, who, is one of the contenders for the throne after he's dead, they have to do something to rein in his behavior, to bring him back down to earth. And so, if you like, he is captured as a type of trial, and he is forced to enter a temple and to say certain prayers and incantations to the gods who would, if you like, judge him. And the judgment of the gods was that he would, in this dream state, have this terrifying encounter, this terrifying journey down to the underworld, to the netherworld, where he would see the land, the city of the dead, the gods. And of course, it's a great story that he will come back a better chastened man and be better, more noble in the future. It's an incredibly rich story. And Irving Finkel has a whole chapter on this story in this book. And then, of course, he has several chapters on necromancy. The role of the necromancer in communing with the ghost and maybe calling up a ghost so that, again, the ghost can give you an insight into reading the future. It was quite a popular thing to do, we think, in the ancient Near East. Certainly in the Cuneiform script, there were many terms to describe the role of a necromancer, and there were whole manuals written in cuneiform describing, again, how the necromancer could do their job. So in Sumerian and Akkadian, there were several terms for the necromancer, as I said, delineating different specialities, highly complex rituals governing how to, if you like, administer or govern a ghost, how to call up a ghost to read the future. And he gives you in this book all these incantations, these rituals, these spells, surrounded by the necessary safeguards. And as in the Hebrew Bible with Saul, when he goes to a necromancer to bring up the great prophet Samuel, when he's beginning to realize that the writings on the wall of that David is maybe going to replace him as the king of Israel. Just like then when Saul goes to the necromancer, and of course it is in the skull, by using the skull and by pouring oils and things into the skull, you can call up a particular ghost to have them tell you what the future might be. And he itemizes in here as well, through all these great manuals of exorcism, the role of a human skull in performing these particular rituals. And so, ghosts who cannot settle, who have a grievance, often to do with the cause of death. If they've had a premature death, either on the battlefield or if they've been murdered by somebody, they will often be a ghost who will run amok, and because they've not lived their proper lifespan. Or of course, as I said, a ghost, they can run amok and come back to haunt us because they're being neglected by the living. There's a breakdown in the offerings and prayers. So seeing a ghost was not always a disaster. It was usually benign and absolutely fine. It was simply a familiar thing. But sometimes these ghosts, as I said, could make not only one person sick by going in through the ear or mouth and making one person sick with mental illness or with other headaches and aches and pains, but they of course could also, if they were bad enough and wicked enough, they could run a whole city to the ground and make a whole city sick. So the role of the diviner and the necromancer in managing all of these things, in sending ghosts back to the netherworld, is all written down in this book with these great rituals and spells and incantations. It's an astounding book. I would really recommend it. You can see all the notes I've taken here. Also by Irving Finkel. I've got this wonderful book that was actually done by the British Museum. It's a book by Irving Finkel and Jonathan Taylor, An Introduction to Cuneiform. It actually gives you insights, if you're interested in learning cuneiform, to read it yourself. There's a really good introduction in here to the system of writing, to how to read it, to the origins of it, how it was used in both the Sumerian and Akkadian, by the Persians, the Hittites. It's a wonderful book, and it's also really rich with, full colour, beautiful photographs and plates. It's a beautiful book, that one by the British Museum. Irving Finkel has also done this book, Writing in the Stone. This is actually a ghost story, a story about a psychopathic necromancer, believe it or not. So it's a historical fiction that Irving Finkel has written to take you right back to ancient Nineveh, the capital of the ancient Assyrian Empire in ancient Iraq. This is an amazing historical fiction. It's not a perfectly told story. He doesn't always have control, particularly over his descriptive language. And sometimes when you're reading it, you really do get sick of, every verb having to have an adverb and every noun having to have an adjective. And his use of descriptive words is sometimes a little cliched, a little over the top. But when you get over that, this is an amazing book. If you want to read an ancient historical fiction set in ancient Assyria about this psychopathic necromancer. It also has many elements, I suppose, of Elizabethan revenge tragedy in it. It's a great story, this. I really recommend it. It's a terrific book. The Writing in the Stone. It's just fabulous. Historical fiction at its best. And then he's written this other quirky book. This is a weird book. The Last Resort Library. I have a feeling this is such a great story. It could have been an absolute hoot. I think it would have been better if he had turned it into a novella or even a short story, because then it would have been really a force of compression and it would have been an absolute hoot to read. This is this quirky thing. It tells the story of this library that is started in a really quiet backwater in England. Of course, there's no public transport to it, so your only way to get to this library, the Library of Last Resort, is by car, by private car. And it has all these people working in the library. They've all got doctorates. One of them has 2 doctorates, doctor, patients, believe it or not. The names in the book are just part of a hoot again. This is just Irving Finkel having a great joy at the expense of academics and, the way we drill down to do a PhD on, finer, ever finer points, angels dancing on a pinhead, that sort of thing. It's just, this is a library where books go that have been rejected by everybody else. They're books that are not good enough to ever get published, to ever see the light of day. So all of these manuscripts, it's a great parody, if you like, a pastiche on modern literary culture, on how so many of us, daydream, fantasize about becoming famous writers, to be the gifted one, the gifted one that has this great gift that the world wants to discover. And so many people now are writing books that will never get published because there are too many people writing. There's never going to be enough space for them, for all these manuscripts. So this is Irving Finkel just having an absolute hoot. It's a great book to read. It is a lot of fun. It goes on for a little bit too long. I at least, do find myself halfway through getting a bit bored and looking forward to when the book finishes. I think it's a little bit long, but it is a real hoot, a really interesting pastiche on modern literary culture. I really recommend it. It's just a fun thing to read. The Last Resort Library. I think it's Irving Finkel just writing a pastiche, having a hoot at everybody's expense. It's an amazing thing. So, as I said, this actual video is on my love affair, my grand love affair with Irving Finkel. I just love him to bits. If you want, he has done many interviews on YouTube. So if you put Irving Finkel into your YouTube search engine, you'll find dozens and dozens of interviews with him where he's talking about ghosts, necromancy, Babylonian magic. He's written all sorts of things about ancient Iran, ancient Iraq, particularly ancient Iraq he specializes in. So he's particularly interested in Sumer, the Assyrians and the Babylonians. So the Sumerian and the Akkadian languages as captured in cuneiform writing systems. My great love affair with Irving Finkel. Oh, put him into your search engine, get an interview. He's just so enthusiastic and passionate. I love him to bits. Irving Finkel, one of my great love affairs. Thank you and bye for now.